Hi, I'm David at Fibonacci. Today I'm going to show you how to create a dataset definition, or a DSD, that gathers together the data that you're going to need to create an fDocs document or fPanels presentation. We'll start a new DSD from scratch. We'll give it an ID and tell fData that it's to be used for fDocs and fPanels. Let's start by getting client details. First, we'll give this data group an ID and select the way in which the data is to be gathered from the list of different methods available. In this case, we're going to use a query from a library of available SQL queries. We'll select the connection or database where the data comes from, and then we'll select the query that we want to use. In this case, we're going to use the client query. fData tells us that this query needs to be supplied with a client ID, so we need to add what's called a user entry. This is a value that will be supplied either by the user entering it, or from a system passing it in order to specify the client for who the data is to be generated. The ID is client ID. We'll give it a label and mark it as mandatory since the DSD needs this value to run. We can also give it a test value so that when we're testing fData and previewing documents and presentations, we won't need to enter a test value every time. Okay, let's test the DSD and see what it's got. We'll save the DSD and use the visualize option to see the data. fData uses fPanels to visualize the data, and you can see here that it's picked up the test client details. Let's go back and add some more data. We'll add warnings, activities, and family members in the same way. Each of these is called a data group. We recommend simple sets of data pulled together into a more complex overall set. This makes it easier to set up and maintain. fData lets you gather quite complex sets of data by building it up from simple data groups. The DSD being built here can be used in any number of fDocs documents and fPanels presentations. DSDs are also used for other purposes, including security checks and lookup lists. All of the data groups that we're adding here require a client ID, but we can add more than one user entry if different values are required. Okay, let's test our DSD. Now we can see all the data groups gathered for the client. If you don't have queries preset in your library, you can add an SQL query directly in fData. We'll add one now to get details about a user. This time the data group type is SQL database query. Again, we're going to select the connection or database, but this time we're entering our query directly. We want to get all details about the logged in user, so in the query we're going to insert a placeholder called login. This will be replaced by the user's login identity when a DSD is run. We can test the query by using a test button underneath. We want to check to make sure it's valid. In the window that appears, we can see there's no errors at the top, so we'll carry on. Now, we'll test the DSD again and see the user data included. You might have noticed that this came from a different database from the other data groups. We can gather data from all different sources and combine it in this way very simply. Another way to test our DSD is to use the Analyze option. This gives us an insight into what's going on during the data gathering process, as well as highlighting any errors and showing in detail the data that's been fetched. It's also an invaluable tool for support. Okay, let's add one last data group to get the activities for each family member. We can use the same library query that we used before for the client's activities, but this time we need to add a couple of extra settings to make it behave exactly how we want it to. This data group will need to be run for every family member to get their activities, and we need to tell fData to use the family member's client ID. This is quite simple to add, but lets us create quite complex datasets in minutes. First, we'll tell fData that the family data group is the parent of this data group. This means that for every family member, this query will be run. Then we need to tell fData that the client ID for this data group is not the user entry that we added earlier, but this is to be taken from the family data group. We'll do this by adding a placeholder called client ID and tell it to get its value from the rel client ID from the family data group. Let's save that. Now we can test it. We'll see that fPanels has added the family activities under its parent. And if I roll over a family member, their activities are shown in the panel below. Finally, having created and tested our DSD, all we need to do is publish it in order to make it available to fDocs and fPanel.